Okay. Whew. I've got a headache. Whew. Alrighty. I am not uncovering the camera this time because it was really distracting last time and I have a terrible headache. So, um, starting at chapter 10 again. Or I'm sorry, chapter 19. Goodness sake, I'm gonna have to edit that. Anyway, chapter 19. Excuse me. Chapter 19 of Hinds Beyond High Places. Chapter 19 is called High Places. Right. And the dog's taking a nap, so won't be interrupted. Um, Grace and Glory, with her handmaidens, Joy and Peace, stayed up on the high places for several weeks while they all explored the heights and learned many new lessons from the king. Excuse me. He led them himself to many places and explained to them as much as they were able to understand at that time. He also encouraged them to explore on their own, for there are always new and lovely discoveries to make up there on the high places. Even these high places were not the highest of all. Others towered above them into the sky, where mortal eye could no longer follow them, and where only those who have finished their pilgrimage life on earth are able to go. Grace and Glory and her friends were on the lowest, the beginner's slopes, in the kingdom of love, and these were the parts which they were to explore and enjoy at this time. From excuse me, from these slopes too, they were able to look down on the valleys below. Excuse me. They were able to look down on the valleys below, and from that new viewpoint gain an understanding of many things which had been puzzling and mysterious to them before. From beneath they had not seen clearly, and even then only a smart part had been visible. The first thing, however, which they realized up there on the slopes of the kingdom of love, was how much more there would be to see and learn and understand when the king took them higher on future occasions. The glorious view which they now enjoyed was but small in comparison with all that lay beyond, and would be visible only from yet higher places above. It was now perfectly evident to them that there must be ranges upon ranges of which they had never dreamed, while they were still down in the narrow valleys with their extraordinarily limited views. Sometimes, as she looked on the glorious panorama visible from these lowest slopes in the kingdom of love, she found herself blushing as she remembered some of the dogmatic statements which she and others had made in the depths of the valley about the high places and the ranges of truth. They had been able to see so little and were so unconscious of what lay beyond and above. If that had been the case while down in the valley, excuse me, how much more clearly she now realized that even up on those wonderful slopes, she was only looking on a tiny corner of the whole. She never tired of looking from the glorious new viewpoint on the first slopes of the kingdom of love, and seeing it all from a new perspective. What she could see and could take in almost intoxicated her with joy and thanksgiving, and sometimes even with inexpressible relief. Things which she had thought dark and terrible, and which had made her tremble as she looked up from the valley, because they seemed so alien to any part of the realm of love, were now seen to be but parts of a great and wonderful whole. They were so altered and modified that as she saw what they extended into, she wondered at having been so blind and stupid, and having such false ideas about them. She began to understand quite clearly that truth cannot be understood from books alone, or by any written words, but only by personal growth and development in understanding, and the things written, even in the book of books, can be astonishingly misunderstood while one still lives on the low levels of spiritual experience and on the wrong side of the grave on the mountains. She perceived that no one who finds herself up on the slopes of the kingdom of love can possibly dogmatize about what is seen there, because that she it is only then that she comprehends how small a part of the glorious whole she sees. All she can do is to gasp with wonder, awe, and thanksgiving, and to long with all her heart to go higher and to see and understand more. Paradoxical as it may seem, as she gazed out on dazzling vistas, so glorious that she could not look at them steadily or grasp their magnificent sweep, she often thought that the prayer which best expressed her heart's desire was that of the blind man. Lord, that I might receive my sight, help me to open myself to more light. Help me to fuller understanding. Another thing which gave her continual joy was their unbroken communion with the king. Wherever he went, she and peace and joy went too, springing behind him with a delight which at times was almost hilarious, for he was teaching and training them to use their hinds feet. Grace and Glory quickly saw, however, that he always chose the way most carefully and restrained his own amazing strength and power, taking only such springs and bounds as they could manage to. So gracefully did he adapt to what was possible to their newly acquired capacity that they scarcely recognized in the exhilaration of leaping and skipping like hinds on the mountains that had he really extended his powers, they would have been left behind completely. For Grace and Glory, who had been lame and limping all her life, the ecstasy of leaping about in this way and of bounding from rock to rock on the high places as easily as the mountain rose, was so rapturous that she could hardly bear to cease from it even for rests. The king seemed to find great delight in encouraging this, and led her on, taking longer and longer leaps, until at last she would be quite breathless. Then, as they sat side by side on some new crag to which he had led her, while she rested, he would point out some of the vistas to be seen from the new viewpoint. On one of these mountains, after they had been on the high places for several days, she flung herself down into the lichen and moss-covered crag to which he had led her, and laughing and breathless said, "Even hinds' feet seem to need a rest now and then." "Grace and Glory," he answered, "do you think you understand now how I was able to make your feet like hinds' feet, and to set you on these high places?" She drew closer to him and looked earnestly in his face and asked, "How are you able to do this, my lord and king?" "Think back over the journey you made," he replied, "and tell me what lessons you learned on the way." She was silent for a while as she reviewed the whole journey, which had seemed so terribly long, and in some places so cruelly difficult and even impossible. She thought of the altars which she had built along the way, of the time when she had stood with him at the trysting place in the valley, when he had called her to follow him to the heights. She remembered the walk to the foot of the mountains, the first meeting with suffering and sorrow, and of learning to accept their help. She recalled the shock of what had seemed like such a heartbreaking detour down into the desert, and of the things which she had seen there. Then their journey along the shores of loneliness, the empty cove which the sea had filled to the brim, and then the agony of disappointment and frustration experienced in the wilderness when the path once again had turned away from the high places. She remembered crossing the great sea wall, walking through the woods and valleys until the rapturous moment when the path had turned back toward the mountains. Her thoughts turned to the precipice of injury and the forests of danger. Excuse me. The forests of danger and tribulation, the great storms which they had sheltered in the hut, and then the mist, the endless mist, and the awful moment when the path suddenly led down into the valley of loss and the nightmare abyss of horror into which she looked when she had thought of turning back. She recalled the descent down into the valley of loss and the peace which she had found there before reascending to the heights in the aerial chairs, and of the days spent in the place where she had been prepared for her burial. Then that last agonizing ascent and the cave where they sheltered from the floods and where she had been tempted to cast away the promises. Then the spring called Marah, and the family, and excuse me, and finally the mist-shrouded grave upon which the peaks where she had been bound to the altar. How little she had imagined when first she set out on that strange journey, what lay ahead of her, and the things which she would be called upon to pass through. So for a long time she sat silent, remembering, wondering, and thankful. At last she put her head in his and said softly, "My lord, I will tell you what I learned." "Tell me," he answered gently. "First," she said, "I learned that I must accept with joy all that you allowed to happen to me on the way, and everything to which the path led me, that I was never to try to evade it, but to accept it and lay down my will on the altar and say, 'Behold me, I am thy handmaiden, acceptance with joy.'" He nodded without speaking, and she went on. "Then I learned that I must bear all that others were allowed to do against me, and to forgive them with no trace of bitterness, and to say to thee, 'Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden, bearing with love,' that I may receive power to bring good out of this evil." Again he nodded, and she smiled still more sweetly and happily. "The third thing that I learned was that you, my lord, never regarded me as I actually was, lame and weak and crooked and cowardly. You saw me as I would be when you had done with me what you promised and had brought me to the high places. When it could be truly said, there is none that walks with such a queenly ease, nor with such grace as she. You always treated me with the same love and graciousness, as though I were a queen already, and not wretched little much afraid." Then she looked up into his face, and for a little time could say no more. But at last she added, "My lord, I cannot tell you how greatly I want to regard others in the same way." A very lovely smile broke out on his face at that, but he still said nothing, only only nodded for the third time and waited for her to continue. "The fourth thing," she said with a radiant face, "was really the first thing I learned up here. Every circumstance in life, no matter how crooked and distorted and ugly it appears to be, if it is reacted to in love and forgiveness and obedience to your will, it can be transformed. Therefore, I begin to think, my lord, you purposefully allowed us to be brought into contact with the bad and evil things that you want changed. Perhaps that is the very reason why we are here in this world, where sin and sorrow and suffering and evil abound, so that we may let you teach us to react to them, that out of them we can create lovely qualities to live forever. That is the only really satisfactory way of dealing with evil. I call it fear, but okay. Of dealing with fear and evil, not simply binding it so that it cannot work harm, but wherever possible overcoming it with love. At last he spoke. You have learned well, Grace and Glory. Now I will add one thing more. It was these lessons which you have learned which enabled me to change you from limping, crippled, much afraid into Grace and Glory with the hinds feet. Now you are to run, leaping on the mountains and able to follow me wherever I go, so that we need never be parted again. So remember this, as long as you are willing to be acceptance with joy and bearing in love, you will never again become crippled, and you will be able to go wherever I lead you. You will be able to go down into the valley of the world to work with me, for that is where the fear and sorrow and ugly things are which need to be overcome. Accept and bear and obey the law of love, and nothing will be able to cripple your hinds feet or to separate you from me. This is the secret of the high places. Grace and glory, it is the lovely and perfect law of the whole universe. It is this that makes the radiant joy of the heavenly places. Then he rose to his feet, drew her up beside him, and said, Now use your hinds feet again, for I am going to lead you to another part of the mountain. Off he went, leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, with Grace and Glory following close behind, and the beautiful figures of peace and joy springing at her side. As they went, she sang this song. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, thou love more strong than death, that I may find through every part the burning fiery breath, and then like wax held in the flame may take the imprint of thy name. Set me a seal upon thine arm, thou love that bursts the grave. Thy coals of fire can never harm, but only purge and save. Thou jealous love, thou burning flame, O burn out all unlike thy name. The floods can never drown thy love, nor weaken thy desire. The rains may deluge from above, but never quench thy fire. Make soft my heart in thy strong flame, to take the imprint of thy name. Canticles 8:8. Canticles is a hymn book. Chapter 20. Return to the valley. The place to which the King of Love now brought them was a most beautiful valley along the peaks of the high places. The whole of this sheltered spot was laid out in quiet gardens and orchards and vineyards. Here grew flowers of rarest beauty and lilies of every description. Here, too, were trees of spices and of many kinds of fruits, and nut trees, almonds, and walnuts, and many other varieties which Grace and Glory had never seen before. Here the king's gardens were always busy, pruning the trees, tending the plants and the vines, and preparing beds for new seedlings and tender shoots. Then the king himself transplanted from uncongenial soil and conditions in the valleys below, so that they might grow to perfection and bloom in the valley high above, ready to be planted in other parts of the kingdom of love, to beautify and adorn it whenever the king saw fit. They spent several delightful days watching the gardeners as they worked under the gracious supervision of the king himself, and accompanying him as they walked into the vineyards, teaching and advising those who tended the vines. One day, however, Grace and Glory, with her two attendants, walked to the end of the valley and found themselves on the very edge of the high places, from which they could look right down into the low places far below. As they stood there, they saw a long green valley between two chains of mountains, through which a river wound like a ribbon of light. Here and there were patches of brown and red which seemed to be villages and dwelling places surrounded with trees and gardens. All of a sudden Grace and Glory gave a queer little gasp, for she recognized the place. They were looking down into the valley of humiliation itself, the place where she had lived in misery for so long, and from which the shepherd had called her to the high places. Without a word, she sat down on the grassy slope, and as she looked, a multitude of thoughts filled her mind. Down there was the little white cottage where she had lived, and the pastures where the shepherds tended the king's flocks. There were the sheepfolds and the stream where the flocks went to drink, and when she had met the shepherd for the first time. In the valley were all her fellow workers and the friends among whom she had lived, and with whom she had enjoyed such happy fellowship. Others she had known were there too, away on the outskirts of the village, where's the cottage where her aunt, dismal forebodings, lived, and where she had spent her miserable childhood, with her cousins, gloomy and spiteful and craven fear. As she thought of them and their wretched existence, a pang of compassion and pain shot through her heart. Poor Aunt Dismal, trying to hide the fact that her heart was broken by her unhappy marriages, which her two daughters had made and embittered by the shameful doings of her darling son. She saw the dwellings of her other relatives and the manor house which decrepit old Lord Fearing lived, tortured by his failing powers and his dread of approaching death. There was the house where pride lived. Near it were the homes of bitterness and resentment, and under the dark trees lived miserable self-pity. She recognized the dwelling places of those who had so harassed her on her journey to the high places, and round about were the homes of other inhabitants of the valley, people who hated or despised or rejected the shepherd. As Grace and Glory sat looking into the valley, the tears welled into her eyes and her heart throbbed with pain, two sensations which she had completely forgotten up there on the high places. Suddenly she discovered that her feelings toward her relatives and those who lived down in the valley had undergone a complete change, and she saw them in a new light. She had thought of them only as horrible enemies, but now she realized that they were just miserable beings, such as she had been herself. They were indwelt and tormented by their different besetting sins and ugly natures, just as she had been by her fears. They were wretched slaves to the natures which gave them their names, and the more horrible the qualities which characterized them, the more misery they endured, and the more we should show them compassion. She could scarcely bear the thought, yet for so many years she had not only feared but also condemned them, had actually disdained their misery, telling herself it was their own fault. Yet she, detestable, fear-enslaved, much afraid, had actually dared to disdain them for the things which made them so wretched and ugly, when she herself was equally wretched and enslaved. Indeed, instead of a fellow feeling of compassionate and passionate desire that they should be delivered and transformed from the pride and resentment and bitterness which had made them what they were. She had just detested and despised them. When she thought of that, she turned to Joy and Peace, who were sitting beside her, and cried out desperately, "Can nothing be done for them down in the valley? My Must my Aunt Dismal be left unhelped, and poor Spiteful and Gloomy too? And those cousins who went so far with us on the way to the high places, trying to turn us back? If the shepherd could deliver me, Grace and Glory, from all my fears and sins, couldn't he deliver them also from the things which tormented them?" "Yes," said Joy, who had been Sorrow, "if he can turn sorrow into joy and suffering into peace and much afraid into grace and glory, how can we doubt that he could change pride and bitterness and resentment and self-pity too, if they would but yield to him and follow him? And your Aunt Dismal could be changed into praise and thanksgiving, and poor Gloomy and Spiteful also. We cannot doubt that it could be done, and that they could be completely delivered from all the things which torment them." "But," cried Grace and Glory, "how can they be persuaded to follow the shepherd? At present they hate him and won't go near him." Then Peace, who before had been suffering, said quietly, "I have noticed that when people are brought into sorrow and suffering, or loss, or humiliation, or grief, or into some place of great need, they sometimes become ready to know the shepherd and to seek his help. We know, for example, that your Aunt Dismal is desperately unhappy over the behavior of poor Craven Fear, and it may be that she would be ready now to turn to the shepherd. Then poor poor Gloomy and Spiteful are so wretched that they felt no need of the shepherd before. It is very possible that now is the time to try and persuade them to seek his help." "Yes," exclaimed Grace and Glory, "I am sure you are right. Oh, if only we could go to them, if only there was some way of helping them to find what we have found." At that very moment, close at hand, sounded the voice of the king. He came and sat down beside them, looked with them down into the valley so far below, and said gently to Grace and Glory, "Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to thy voice. Cause me to hear it." Canticles 8:13. Grace and Glory turned to him and laid their hand upon his arm. My Lord," they said, "we were talking about the people who live down there in the Valley of Humiliation. They are my relatives, you know, all of them. They are so wretched and miserable. What can we do for them, my lord? They don't know anything about the joy of the high places and of the kingdom of love. There is my poor Aunt Dismal Forebodings. I lived with her for a long time and know that she is utterly wretched." "I know her," said the king quietly. "She is a most unhappy woman." And her daughter Gloomy went on Grace and Glory, looking at him entreatingly as she spoke. "She married Coward, the son of old Lord Fearing, very rich, but much older than herself, and a miserable, unhappy, and selfish creature. I believe she has not known a moment's peace since. There was talk in the valley before I came away that he was likely to desert her. He has done so," answered the king quietly, "and she has returned to her mother in the cottage, a miserable and disillusioned woman with a broken heart. And her sister, Spiteful, poor, poor soul, with her sharp tongue, which makes so many enemies and deprives her of friends. She married Timid Skulking, and they are desperately poor and have to live in one one little rented room in the house of my cousin Bitterness and his wife. I cannot bear to think of their wretched condition while I live up here on the kingdom of love. They are wretched indeed, said the king, even more gently and compassionately than before. They have just lost their little daughter, who, poor spiteful, had hoped would be a comfort to them in their dreary circumstances. And then, continued Grace and Glory, with just a hint of hesitation in her voice, there is their brother Craven Fear. She did not look at the king as she spoke, but paused a moment, then went on hurriedly. He is the most unhappy member of the whole family. He has broken his mother's heart. Neither of his sisters will speak to him any more, and he goes skulking about the valley, hated by everyone. I know him, replied the king gravely, but with just a hint of a smile. I know him well. You do not exaggerate when you speak of his wretchedness. I have had to interfere and chastise him many times to try and correct his bullying propensities. But though I have chastened him sore, I have not given him over unto death. No, no, cried Grace and Glory imploringly. Don't ever do that, my lord. Oh, I beg you, find some way to rescue and deliver him from himself, as you delivered me. He made no answer for a little while, only looked at her very kindly and with a look of great contentment and happiness on his face. At last he spoke. I am more than willing to do what you suggest, he said. But Grace and Glory, these unhappy souls we are speaking about now will not allow me into their houses, nor even permit me to speak to them. I need a voice to speak for me, to persuade them to let me help them. I see what you mean, she cried joyfully. We will go down with you and speak to them and show them what you have done for us and what you are willing and able to do for them. Do you think they will listen to you? He asked, smiling at her very gently as he spoke. No, I don't think it's likely at all, at least not at first, she answered. I was not at all the sort of person to make them want to listen to me. I did not behave at all lovingly to them, but you will tell me what to say. You will teach me, and I will say it for you. Oh, my lord, let us make haste and go down there. When they see what you have done for me, when they see peace and joy, I do think in the end they will want to help them too. It is because they have lied to themselves about you and have persuaded themselves that you cannot do them good, and they resist you and turn away from your help. But we will plead with them, especially now, my lord, when they are so unhappy and so despised by others. Their very misery and loneliness and sorrow will make them more willing to listen to news of your grace and of your desire to help them. True, he agreed. That is just what I wanted. That is just what I want. That is just what I think. This is indeed a specially favorable time for us to go down and try to help them. He rose to his feet as he spoke. She sprang up too, and all four stood joyful and radiant on the edge of the high places, ready to go leaping down into the valley again. Then Grace and Glory saw that the great waterfall quite close at hand was leaping down into the valley with joy, with the tumultuous, joyful noise of many waters singing as they poured themselves over the rock lip. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys down below, sweetest urge and sweetest will to go lower, lower still. Suddenly she understood. She was beholding a wondrous and glorious truth. A great multitude whom no man could number, brought like herself, by the king to the kingdom of love and to the high places, so that they could now pour out their lives in gladdest abandonment, leaping down with him to the sorrowful, desolate places below, to share with others the life which they had received. She herself was only one drop among the glad, exultant throng of self-givers, the followers of the King of Love, united with him and with one another, each one equally blessed and beloved as herself. For he loves each one of us, she said. She said to herself, as though there were the only one to love. The thought of being made one with the great fall of many waters filled her heart with ecstasy, and with a rapturous joy beyond power to express. She too, at last, was to go down with them, pouring herself forth in love's abandonment of self-giving. He brought me to the heights just for this, she whispered to herself, and then looked at him and nodded. At that he began leaping and springing down the mountainside before them, bounding from rock to rock, always choosing, however, leaps which were within their power to follow, and sure footholds for less experienced feet. Behind him went Grace and Glory, with Joy and Peace beside her, leaping down just as the waters leapt and sprang beside them. They mingled their voices in the joyful music of the many waters, singing their own individual song. Make haste, beloved, be thou like a heart on mountains spicy sweet, and I on those high places where thou art will follow on hinds feet. As close behind the heart there leaps the roe, so where thou goest I will surely go. That, as perhaps you know, is the last verse of the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. But for Grace and Glory, it was the beginning of a new song altogether. And then it goes on by the author, Hannah Hurnard, talking about how she lost her parents and I think a brother, something like that. I can't remember. But she lost people that were very important in her life, and that's what brought her to write this book. So that's the book. It's a great book. It goes so far beyond just Christianity. It goes so far beyond any religious ideas. Of course, this woman is speaking from a Christian standpoint. She uses the Bible, but the more important part about it is that, I mean, Socrates or Plato's allegory of the cave is not only for philosophers. It's applicable to everyone's life. And that's a point that I wanted to make before I ended, is that it's not about religion. It's not about what you call God. It's about the understanding of it, the understanding of the greater whole. And so I really encourage people who are not believers to listen with an open ear, and people who are believers to realize that still, we might just be on the beginner slopes. Only we know where we are, and the Lord knows where we are on the great journey. So, and you can hear that in the analogies and metaphors that are used in the book, that there are places far beyond that. She dies on the altar, right? But she's still alive. So that would be an ego death. And these are important ideas. It's the subtext to the book, right? It's not just the context of the situations in the book, but the subtext of it. That's very important to understand. That she's going back down into the valley after all this, right where she came from. There are so many beautiful, really profound. It sounds like such an easy read. Not using any particularly complex vocabulary or very complicated metaphors or analogies, and using quoting scripture from the Bible specifically. But the ideas are applicable. That's what I love about this book, is that the ideas are applicable across the board. Yeah, it's good. I hope you enjoyed that, and if anybody wants me to read the rest of it from beginning to end, let me know. Should I be like the other YouTubers? Hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment down in the comments. That feels so cheesy. Oh well. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed that. That is the end of the book, but not the end of the journey.